I worked as a cocktail waitress when I was 22. My shift was from 5 p.m. until 2 a.m. As a waitress, I'd become used to being harassed. Usually, it wasn't anything too over the top or frightening. Most customers were regulars who flirted innocently. Just good-natured banter, nothing threatening or in any way sinister. Up until this night, I'd never felt a sense of danger from any of the customers I'd waited on. On this particular night, though, everything changed. I was being harassed by a creepy customer I'd never seen before. He'd said such inappropriate things to me that creeped me out. He was relentless with his inappropriate remarks. At one point, as I was serving him his drink, he reached out and put his hand on my back. After this happened, I never went back to his table again. If he wanted another drink, he'd have to go up to the bar and ask the bartender. I was through with waiting on this sinister creep. This happened back in 1978, so it was a time when I didn't have any recourse when things like this happened. The bartender only made customers leave when they were far too drunk to sit on a bar stool or at a table or booth. Otherwise, we were on our own to deal with creepy customers. At closing, he finally left. Even though he was gone, I still felt such a sense of unease. I wasn't easily spooked, but this guy had really freaked me out. There was just something off about him. It took me nearly an hour after closing to complete the work and cleaning I had to do to have the bar ready for the following day. So it was about 3 a.m. as I made my way through the dark parking lot to get to my car. It was such a deserted and isolated place at night. The parking lot had woods that surrounded it. That, in and of itself, was creepy. But, as I was about halfway to my car, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. My heart began to pound as I realized that he had waited in the lot for me to come out. I knew I had to get to the safety of my car, or this man was going to do God knows what to me. I was young and fit, whereas this man was in his late 40s and overweight. My thoughts were quickly assessing my situation. I didn't want to be kidnapped and murdered. That was the scenario I envisioned if this man got to me before I could get to my car. I knew I'd have to make a run for it. I ran as fast as possible. I jumped inside the car and locked the door. It wasn't one moment too soon, because this man was now at my driver's side window, demanding me to roll it down. He kept yelling that he didn't want to hurt me, he only wanted to talk. He began to pound on the window as I fumbled with my keys to try to get the hell out of there. I began to fear that he'd shatter my window and get his hands on me. Finally, I got my car started, and as I put the car into reverse and backed out, he began to scream bloody murder. He was yelling for me to stop because I'd run over his foot. My gut instinct told me that this man was faking the injury to get me out of my car. I was not going to get out of that car for any reason. I drove home as fast as I could. Once home, I called the police. They came to take my report and get my description of the guy. At this point, I wasn't certain about whether I had injured him or not. I explained all of this to the police officer. The police sent another officer to the parking lot to see if he was still there and suffering from an injury. He wasn't there. Nobody called the police to report a hit and run either. The police told me that I'd done the right thing by not falling for his ruse. I called my boss the following day and told him that I wouldn't be returning to work. I'd never been so frightened by anyone before. It was a night in which I truly feared for my life. There was no way I could make myself return to the job. That night still haunts my dreams.
Last year, I was staying in a university hall for my final year. It's a private building, so not connected to the university, and out in the city near the main town. We have a car park, but nobody really uses it because we are poor students and it costs money to park there, so mine was one of only 2 or 3 cars at any given time. The car park isn't well lit and it's to the side of the building, so you have to walk for about 2 or 3 minutes to get into the main door. I was sitting in my car one evening after getting back from the gym, just scrolling on my phone because my seat was warm and it was dark and raining outside, so I couldn't be bothered to get up yet. I was reading an article when suddenly someone started knocking on my window, which was really odd. It was a man dressed all in black, and he started telling me how his friend had seen me through the window and thought I was really attractive, so could he have my number? I responded, no, that's a bit odd and I don't feel comfortable with it. He continued to be insistent for a while, practically begging me to get out and give them my number or my social media details, telling me I should come over and speak to his friend, who was weirdly stood at the other side of the car park, furthest away from the building. I kept saying no, and scrolling on my phone to show that I wasn't interested. He finally relented and walked away. I texted one of my friends to ask if he'd come and get me and walk with me to the building. As I was waiting, this man returned, but now with his hood up, and he started banging loudly on my window, saying that I was being rude, ungrateful, calling me all kinds of names. I kept staring at my phone and pretended I couldn't hear him. He then started trying my door handle. Thankfully, I'd locked my car after the first encounter, and then began violently pushing into my car when it didn't work. I still kept ignoring him and text for my friend to probably bring some other friends with him. My friend was taking a long time to read my message, and I was terrified, but for some reason didn't think to call the police. Probably because I was scared of things escalating. The guy at my window had calmed down after a few minutes and walked off, saying that he'd leave me alone now. However, I watched him out of the corner of my eye, join up with his friend and then maybe 3 or 4 other men. They walked so that they were out of sight, but I could see their shadows lingering as they kind of circled around my car and moved towards the building but staying in the dark. They lingered there for a while, until luckily another car came, which was obviously full of students going to a party, due to the loud music and singing going on inside. This group of men left as they saw these people arrive, and I latched on to them and was able to walk with them as they entered the building. When I got home, my friend finally responded. He said that he'd actually heard about these guys before. Apparently they'd followed another girl into the building and into the lift a couple of days prior, then stood in the lift making really gross sexual comments to her. She'd had to run to her door and lock it, where they'd then stood outside knocking on the door and whispering for her to open it. We were able to report this to the building, who, to their credit, then hired a permanent set of security staff. We also got the CCTV footage of both incidents and were able to pass this on to police. So, weird men harassing young women at my university building. Let's not cross paths again.
I currently work at a restaurant somewhere in the Midwest. Now obviously I can't say what restaurant, but it's on a pretty busy road, with lots of cars, and lots of people walking on the road to get to the bus stop or whatever their destination may be. It's got its own parking lot, where I usually will park closer to the doors, but the story I'm about to tell is the one time I didn't. That night, I sincerely regret my actions. To give some backstory, a couple of years ago, I just so happened to work at the sports bar and grill directly across the parking lot from my current job. I worked there for just 4 months, and I have plenty of interesting stories about that place. Anyways, while I worked at my previous job, I did not have a car, so I either walked to and from work, or I got a ride. Now mind you, I would walk home at around 10 some nights, on a barely lit road when cars weren't always around. This naturally made me weary, and this was on top of the fact that older men would constantly hit on me as a minor and make me feel watched. This backstory of my old job might not seem important at the moment, and I didn't think it would ever become relevant again, but it matters in the end, I promise. While working at my old job, I was a minor, as previously stated, but that never stopped drunken men from approaching me and being inappropriate. There was one man in particular who I never forgot about, and who came back to haunt me in the worst way. The man was taller, quite good-looking, and always wore expensive-looking clothing and accessories. He had a very elegant vibe to him, which is why I did not think much of him when he would talk to me while I was working. He started out very polite. He'd ask about how work was going, how my day was, stuff like that. But as the weeks went on, he would ask more and more personal questions, which started making me suspicious of him. The event that occurred right before I quit was a night I wish I could forget, when thinking back on my days at that sports bar. I remember it being a long night, probably because it was a sports season and our restaurant would get very busy, and as a hostess, it was stressful trying to take calls when there was shouting because the hockey team won a golden cup or whatnot. That night, after I had finished cleaning the bathrooms, I remember him being at the hostess stand waiting for me. I approached him and tried to make polite conversation, but I could tell immediately that he was acting strange. His gaze was shifty and he didn't look as put together as he normally did. The first thing he said to me was something along the lines of, "You're only 16, right?" To which I confirmed, and he continued with something like, "Well, when you're 18, I'll have something for you. It'll be a surprise, just wait till you're 18." And he promptly left through the bar section of the grill. I stood shocked for a moment before composing myself and finishing my cleaning so I could get the hell out of there. After I finished counting my drawer down, I went out back and unlocked the bike that I had gotten a month or so after I started working there, and began to ride home. Note that I was paranoid as hell as I was doing this because seriously, who the fuck says that to an underage girl? I watched my back all night as I rode home and felt watched the entire time. It was kind of my fault he knew my age. I had told him a long time ago as I mentioned something about birthday plans, but his comment on my age made me feel sick to my stomach regardless. Now let's jump to more recently, when I started my new job just across the parking lot. It's been years since I worked there, and I had just about let go of the memories of working at the godforsaken sports bar, but something happened recently that made the memories feel like yesterday. The stimulus checks and nice weather have brought a surge of customers to my current restaurant. I've worked here for almost a year now, and we have been busier in the past month than we've been since I first started. This means that occasionally I don't get to park right by the doors, and I must park a bit further away. On this particular day that still makes me feel nervous thinking about, I had to park basically at the farthest corner of our lot due to a large amount of staff and customers taking the closer spots. That day, I thought nothing of it as I went in for my closing shift, and worked a long and stressful shift until about 10 p.m. I work at the front of the restaurant, and our closing duties can be pretty grueling. That night was especially bad because I was the only one up front beside the manager, who has to go back and forth between kitchen and front to help. I finished all of my cleaning, albeit a bit later than usual, and felt bad for taking so long, but they weren't too upset because a co-worker of mine was waiting on a ride, so they had to wait anyways. So with that, I say my goodbyes to the two of them and head out the back doors to my car. I immediately was irritated that I had to walk so far to get to my car, and I started digging for my keys. I didn't realize that there was a third car in our parking lot until it was almost too late. I finally grabbed my keys after a moment of struggling to find them and realized that the third car is in fact not my manager's, and it was parked right next to mine. Although it did look similar, which is why I didn't think much of it at first, being exhausted from work. Upon getting closer, I realized there is a person inside, so I remember thinking, is my co-worker's ride here? But no one came out to go home, so I assumed not. I looked back closer to the restaurant and realized that in front of the building, where I couldn't see before as I left out the back, my manager's car was sitting empty right up front. All of these thoughts were piecing together as I slowly trailed to my car, and after connecting the dots, I tried to see who was in the car waiting for me. I remember squinting at them. I didn't have my glasses on. And that's probably what made them realize I noticed them, and with that, they turned on their car. Immediately, I looked away because the car lights were too bright, and when I tried to look back again, the cabin light was turned on. I stopped dead in my tracks, as if paralyzed. Just writing this is starting to make my eyes tear up for some reason, but the expression that this man was wearing invoked so much fear, I think my heart quite literally skipped a beat. The man's features were a bit blurry with the distance and darkness, but I could tell he knew me from somewhere with that little overhead light illuminating his face. The lack of facial expression is what really made me scared shitless, because I figured he would smile, frown, wave, anything. Instead, he sat there, arms at his sides as he waited for me to come closer. Now as a young woman, I should know better than to ignore my instincts telling me to get the hell out of a situation. But for a split second, I almost felt compelled to continue towards my car. I can't explain why, but I distinctly recall taking one step forwards before pausing, asking myself, what the hell am I doing? And then hightailing it back to the back door. I felt like I was prey about to be eaten, the way that I sensed his overwhelming presence behind me. The whole time I debated going back and then running to safety, he just sat right in his seat and didn't move an inch. Or so I assume, as I did not look back until I reached the door. I glanced back at his car for a split second before dashing inside, and all I remember seeing was his cabin light had turned off and I could only see a dark figure. The menacing light no longer illuminated his face. I didn't need to see his face to know he was still staring. I could feel his beady eyes staring right at me. After scaring the hell out of my co-workers by yanking open the back door as I did, I explained what happened. They both immediately got serious and told me to wait with them while they waited for my other workers' ride. We sat for a few more minutes. They talked about how freaky the situation was, and how they'd call the cops if he was still there when we went outside together, and I sat in silence. I was silent because in the few minutes after the encounter with the strange man, I knew I recognized him from somewhere. He was that same guy who had told me to wait for him when I turned 18. It took me a while because he didn't look like he used to. He looked much more bedraggled, a bit older, and much, much scarier. I don't know if he saw me that day as I brought out the trash, or maybe when I walked into work, but he knew I was there somehow, and that scared the shit out of me. When their ride finally arrived, we all walked out together, and my eyes instantly shot to the area where I knew his car was parked. It was just my car though, waiting for me to climb inside and get home. The manager saw my co-worker off into their parents' car and walked me to mine. She helped me check under my car and inside, as apparently she had dealt with a stalker before and knew all of the tricks to stay safe. I thanked her profusely and got in, locking my doors right away. I watched her as she walked to her car and started to leave the lot. I looked frantically to see if I could spot his car anywhere in the shopping area that connected with our parking lots, but found nothing. I live close by my work, so I took a long way home that night, fearing that he was waiting for me to go home to do something sinister. Needless to say, I didn't sleep well that night, as I kept thinking that he was in the darkest corner of my room with that hollow expression on his face. I considered making a police report, but seeing as the police tend to be useless in scenarios like this, and I literally only had a first name, which could have been fake, I decided against it. In the weeks since then, I haven't seen him or heard from him. I still think about him every time I leave the building, half expecting him to be either standing outside ready to snatch me or parked right next to my car. I always leave with my co-workers now, as my parents insisted I begin doing after I told them about what happened. To this day, I still wonder why he remembered that I was 18, almost 19 now, but he didn't know exactly when my birthday was, because I had almost completely forgotten him. I hope that I never do find out what a surprise he was waiting for me.